is clinical educators' perceptions of ASHA's 2-hour required course related to supervision. Is it enough? Dr. Me nor myself have any financial or non-financial disclosures. First, I'd like to describe a little bit about myself. Currently, I'm a speech-language pathologist at Miami Jewish Health and an adjunct professor at Florida International University. Last year, I completed my educational doctorate at the University of St. Augustine for Health Sciences. My dissertation focused on clinical educators' perceptions of the 2020 standard requiring the 0.2 hours of CEUs. Over the past 25 years, I have provided clinical education to more than 20 students in various settings. Dr. Jane Mead is the coordinator of clinical education at Florida International University. Her role includes managing all aspects of interns' clinical experiences. She also meets regularly with clinical supervisors and provides education related to clinical instruction on a one-to-one basis as needed. Her research interests include the supervisory process and mindfulness practice. The learning objectives for this session are, number one, describe clinical educators' overall perceptions of the required training. Number two, explain the perceived effectiveness and sufficiency of the 2-hour training. Number three, discuss recommendations for enhancing or improving the 2-hour requirements. I'm going to skip over slide number 5. This just gives a brief overview of my experience with clinical education. Let's roll into an introduction of the topic. Successful completion of a graduate program in speech-language pathology requires that graduate students enter clinical practicum experiences where they bridge the gap between didactic knowledge and real-life client care. These experiences must be obtained under the direct instruction and supervision of an ASHA-certified speech-language pathologist who has fulfilled the 2-hour minimum required course in clinical education and supervision. Before 2020, clinical educators were not required to complete any continuing education courses related to the clinical education process. Effective January 2020, ASHA standards were updated to include a mandatory one-time 2-hour continuing education course in clinical education and supervision. Before diving into the clinical education pool, my topic of interest, here is some background information to give you some perspective relevant to my dissertation journey. On a personal note, by the 5th graduate student, this was in 2010, it was evident to me that I needed to learn more about how to be an effective clinical educator. Fast forwarding to 2020, 10 years later, this ended with my decision to pursue a dissertation regarding the clinical education process, particularly with the perspectives of clinical educators and supervisors. I found research supporting my intuitions relative to the clinical education process across all disciplines and particularly within speech-language pathology. A first notion was supported by studies and articles indicating that clinical education experiences across all healthcare disciplines help students develop specific and interdisciplinary skills. A second notion specific to speech-language pathology was that effective clinical education requires well-trained speech-language pathologists with the necessary knowledge and skills to instruct future therapists. A third notion confirmed my suspicions. Many clinical educators in healthcare lack the necessary training to provide effective clinical education. Now, that's not to say that there are no guiding factors to providing clinical education and supervision. However, Most of the research to date is found in the gray literature. During a review of the literature, there was a thorough check of the existing research. This included the examination of clinical education in both allied health professions and speech-language pathology, the definitions applicable to clinical education and supervision, and goals of both allied health professions and speech-language pathology. There were minimal publications regarding the perceived experiences of speech-language pathology clinical educators. The available literature described andragogy and adult learning principles as aspects of training for speech-language pathology clinical educators. Specific recommendations for incorporating adult learning principles into such training were not included. The following 7 slides will provide specific points directing my research efforts. In 2014, Paul et al. Indicated that the involvement of clinical educators in research may reveal natural and unseen nuances that occur while teaching graduate students. In 2018, Gibson et al. Stated that obtaining clinical educators' fresh and unique perspectives may prove valuable while creating training opportunities for future clinical education. This input may ultimately affect the preparation of future professionals and patient care. Excuse me. In 2013, ASHA identified clinical education as a distinct area of practice, recommending clinical educators receive formal training to better foster the growth of future professionals. There is a gap between what is known in speech-language pathology clinical education and what is known in other allied health professionals related to training clinical educators. Reducing this gap can be accomplished by examining the current body of literature. In slide 9, I mentioned andragogy and adult learning principles. Let's delve into Knowles and his colleagues' perspectives on adult learning theory. In the 1980s, Knowles and his colleagues furthered their research by discovering that the core adult learning principles of andragogy require that educators carefully determine which ones are applicable within any given learning situation. Although there are clear distinctions between pedagogy and andragogy, adult learning is not an ideology, but rather an alternative set of assumptions regarding the learners. Therefore, educators must continuously reflect upon the design and implement of instruction based upon these dispositions of the learners. This led to the development of core learning principles of andragogy for learners. Number 1, learners need to know why, what, and how. They are autonomous and self-directing and have a very good self-concept. Their experiences should include resources and mental models. Learners possess the readiness to learn. Their orientation to learning is problem-centered and contextual. They have intrinsic value and motivation. In the 1980s, Knowles and his colleagues furthered their research by discovering that the core adult learning principles of andragogy require that educators carefully determine which ones are applicable within any given learning situation. Although there are clear distinctions between pedagogy and andragogy, adult learning is not an ideology, but rather an alternative set of assumptions regarding the learners. Therefore, educators must continuously reflect upon the design and implementation of instruction based on the dispositions of the learners. In 2017, Procini et al. Indicated the need for ongoing research in clinical education within speech-language pathology will result in more competent clinicians and transform clinical practice. In 2018, Gibson et al. Pointed out the skills and qualities of effective clinical educators are linked to improved student learning and ultimately patient care. However, within allied health, these have not been systematically summarized in the literature. A final point by these authors is that clinical education continues to be an essential component for future healthcare professionals across multiple disciplines. Gardner et al. In 2021 found that despite the recommendations for well thought out clinical education using existing research, there were limited published frameworks guiding clinical educators in their efforts. This point stood out to me as crucial for selecting my dissertation topic. Without awareness of and access to appropriate resources, training, and support, clinical educators rely on trial and error approaches to clinical instruction. In 2021, Gardner et al. Indicated that developing models and frameworks and using them consistently to guide clinical education may improve access and effectiveness of clinical education for allied health professions. The preceding points from the literature review strongly support ongoing research to understand clinical educators' perspectives and ensure effective guidelines and associated clinical education training. While moving through the literature review, the problem became evident to me. The current ASHA standard updated in 2020 requiring the one-time 2-hour minimum continuing education course may not prove to be adequate in preparing speech-language pathologists to provide effective clinical education. The gaps in the literature included no studies were found that obtained speech-language pathologists' clinical educators' perspective, and their perspective on efficacy of the 2-hour CEU course specifically. The statement of the problem helped to establish the purpose of the study. The purpose of this study was to explore clinical educators' experiences while providing clinical education to SLP graduate students during off-site clinical rotations following the ASHA's update of the standards in 2020. The initial intention was to obtain results that would provide valuable information regarding how SLP clinical educator training and clinical education may be improved, with suggestions and feedback from the viewpoint of the individuals participating in these continuing education courses. Although my focus remains on SLP clinical educators, an understanding of these unique experiences may provide direction for developing educational opportunities beneficial for all clinical educators across the disciplines. The adult learning principles of andragogy by Malcolm Knowles and colleagues were selected for the following reasons as the conceptual framework for this study. Number one, these principles guide moving towards a learning-centered approach in clinical education that places the SLP clinical educator in a position of a guide rather than a director. The second, these principles better support learners in the transition from student to workforce-ready practitioner. Thirdly, using this conceptual framework facilitates the development of students' critical thinking skills by the end of their program. Fourth, these principles facilitate achievement of learning outcomes during off-site clinical placements that will result in independence of future professionals responsible for their professional growth and development once licensed. And finally, the fifth, incorporating these experiences of SLP clinical educators into the planning and development of future CEU opportunities also follows the principles of adult learning theory. The following 4 research questions guided the development of semi-structured interview questions used in the data collection. Research question 1. After completing the ASHA required training, what are SLP clinical educators' perceptions of their readiness to provide clinical education during off-site clinical practicum experiences? Research question number 2. What are the perceived challenges SLP clinical educators encounter while providing clinical education to graduate students during off-site clinical experiences? Research question number 3, what are the perceived benefits of SLP clinical educators when providing clinical education to graduate students during off-site clinical practicum experiences? And research question number 4, what do SLP clinical educators recommend to improve the ASHA required training so that clinical educators can provide more effective clinical education to graduate students? There are 3 main points making the significance of this study. The results of the study, ASHA updated the standards in January of 2020 that included a new requirement for speech language pathologists seeking to become clinical educators. First, this study addresses the gap in the literature by examining clinical educators' experiences in speech language pathology following this new requirement. Secondly, this study helps to gain an understanding of the experiences of current SLP clinical educators that could facilitate development and build efficacy of SLP continuing education opportunities. Thirdly, gaining these experiences can demonstrate relevance of incorporating adult learning principles during clinical practicum experiences with students and in continuing education opportunities of SLP clinical educators. To best seek to understand how meaning is constructed and how people make sense of their experiences within the context of their lives, a basic qualitative design was used. This design incorporates a framework that is a descriptive, holistic, value-laden, affords flexibility, and is deeply rooted within the context from which the data is collected. The use of a basic qualitative design assisted with the understanding of how the participating SLP clinical educators interpreted their experiences related to clinical education since the update of the ASHA standards in 2020. Given the targeted group, purposeful and homogeneous sample narrowed the broad group of allied health professionals to the subgroup of SLP clinical educators. Inclusion criteria required that participants have instructed at least one SLP graduate student since 2020, when the ASHA update of the standards requiring the one-time 2-hour CEU course related to clinical education. Approximately 80 SLP clinical educators from a major university in South Florida received an email invite. 10 to 20 replies were expected. However, only 7 were eligible to participate in this study. I'm going to skip over the demographics for the sake of time. Basically, there was, given the small sample size, there was still quite a variety of these participants. An interview guide containing an introductory statement about the study and the semi-structured interview questions to assist with the data collection process was created. The 12 interview questions were developed from the 4 research questions to assure appropriate data were collected. Probing questions, which were more open-ended in nature, helped gather any additional information on ideas of interest needed. Before beginning in the 6 steps of data collection, approval to conduct the study from the University of St. Augustine for Health Sciences Institutional Review Board was obtained. Step number 1, as previously stated, sampling used purposeful and homogeneous sampling to specifically target speech language pathology clinical educators. Step 2, clinical placement coordinator from the large university in South Florida provided a list of these emails of the SLP clinical educators. Step number 3, 12 semi-structured interview questions aligned with the 4 research questions were developed. Step 4, a protocol was developed for collecting and recording data. Step 5, member checking was completed as a method of respondent validation. Each participant was emailed a copy of the transcribed interview and provided with 1 week to review for any needed revisions. Throughout the process, ethical guidelines were followed to protect and secure the participants' data. The following 6 interview questions and 1 probing question addressed research for question 1. Further ahead, each research question is stated with their findings. The following 2 interview questions and 1 probing question address research question 2. The following question and 1 probing question addressed research question number 3. The following 3 interview questions and 1 probing question addressed research question number 4. Once the 6 steps of data collection were completed, I began the data analysis process. The first step involved familiarization of the transcribed data through multiple reviews of the participants' transcribed responses placed on an Excel spreadsheet, noting any obvious similarities. The second step required the identification and labeling of interesting features or codes within the data set. The third step necessitated a collection of all identified codes into potential themes using a color scheme. Step 4 required careful inspection of the identified themes and their respective coded extracts, thereby creating a separate thematic mapping in the analysis. The 5th step necessitated an ongoing review of the evolving themes and subthemes to produce an overall narrative with clear descriptions and names. Self-reflection occurred regarding the overall process thus far. The 6th and final step resulted in a final analysis clearly representing the data set. This finalized interpretation was used to compare to the conceptual framework. Upon completion of the data analysis, 4 major themes emerged from the participants' responses. These included theme number 1, overall positive perceptions of the ASHA required training. Theme number 2, there were multiple barriers to providing SLP clinical education to graduate students. Theme number 3, there are limited tangible benefits to being a clinical educator in speech language pathology. Theme number 4, more continuing education related to the clinical education process is needed. So in terms of the actual themes and sub-themes, I'm not going to spend too much time on these because it would require a lot of extra time. So just to give you an idea, the first sub-theme for research question number 1, the ASHA required CEU course increased my preparedness for the role as a clinical educator. For research question number 2, the first sub-theme, my productivity expectations remained the same despite an added responsibility. For research question number 3, subtheme number 1, my contributions to the future of the field provide me with a sense of accomplishment. And for research question number 4, the major subtheme was my contributions to the future of the field provide a sense of accomplishment. A first examination of the perceptions of SLP clinical educators regarding how the recent ASHA-required 2-hour continuing education course affected their provision of clinical education to graduate students reflected the following. Results indicated increased preparedness for the role of clinical educator, increased effectiveness as a clinical educator, and a strategic approach during interactions. The findings of this study are in line with Gardner et al. And Gibson et al. In that speech-language pathology clinical educators need well-designed continuing education opportunities to provide effective clinical education. Wright and Needham indicated that too little training of SLP clinical educators might be more prevalent than previously thought. The indispensable role of the future of speech-language pathologists could greatly improve by ongoing preparation beyond the one-time 2-hour ASHA-required CEU course. An ongoing and collaborative effort between practicing SLPs, clinical educators, and academic programs could assist in determining the hierarchy of needs for creating future continuing education courses. The findings of this study reveal the need for developing new and innovative continuing education opportunities. This fresh perspective opened the door to future research addressing the distinct needs of SLP clinical educators. The findings and themes suggest a closer look at the specific clinical education needs of SLP clinical educators. A needs assessment regarding resources and topics of interest was one of the quotes from one of the participants. The findings of this study are in line with Gardner et al. 2021 and Gibson et al. 2018, in that SLP clinical educators need well-designed continuing education opportunities to provide effective clinical education. Wright and Needham in 2016 indicated that too little training of clinical educators might be more prevalent than previously thought. The indispensable role of instructing future SLPs could greatly be improved by ongoing preparation. Replicating the current study with a larger sample size, including participants from various regions of the country, could provide potential target for future research. A second suggestion is to expand upon the fourth theme, which had to do with a need for more continuing education beyond the required 2 hours. One way to expand upon the theme would be to explore the existing theoretical frameworks and models for other disciplines who educate their clinical educators. For example, physical therapy, occupational therapy, and nursing. A third recommendation was for future speech-language pathologists if they could explore critical components to be included in the 2-hour ASHA-required continuing education course. A current research project that I'm involved in with Dr. Maria Teresa Munoz explored the graduate students' experiences regarding AAC services while enrolled in an SLP graduate student program. We gained a sense of whether or not students perceive themselves ready for clinical practice related to assessing and treating individuals with complex communication needs. We will be presenting these results at this ASHA convention. Thank you very much.